The musty scent of old paper and forgotten memories filled the cramped basement of the Millbrook Historical Society as Dr. Sarah Chen carefully lifted another dusty box from the metal shelving. October rain drummed against the small windows near the ceiling, casting shifting shadows across the concrete walls, lined with decades of archived documents and photographs. Sarah had been working in this windowless maze for 3 weeks now, cataloguing materials for her research on 19th-century orphanages in New England. As a historian specializing in child welfare institutions, she had seen her share of heartbreaking records, but something about Millbrook felt different. The town seemed to hold its secrets close, wrapped in layers of silence that even time couldn't penetrate. She opened the cardboard box labeled Millbrook Children's Home 1885-1892 and found herself staring at a collection of sepia-toned photographs bound with a fraying ribbon. The top image made her breath catch in her throat. A young girl, no more than 9 years old, stood at imposing iron gates that stretched up into the frame like prison bars. The child wore a simple grey dress with a white apron that had seen better days, its fabric stained and torn at the edges. But it was the girl's eyes that stopped Sarah cold. They were enormous in her gaunt face, dark pools that seemed to stare directly through the camera lens and into Sarah's soul. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that didn't belong in a child's face. The girl's pale hands gripped the iron bars of the gate, and Sarah could almost feel the cold metal beneath her own fingertips. Sarah turned the photograph over and found spidery handwriting in faded ink. Emma Whitmore, age 9, December 15, 1888, last known photograph before disappearance. A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. She had researched dozens of orphanages, read countless tragic stories of children who had disappeared into the night, but this photograph felt different. It felt alive somehow, as if the girl's presence lingered in the very fibers of the paper. Thunder rolled overhead, and the lights flickered momentarily. In that brief darkness, Sarah could have sworn she saw movement in the photograph, a subtle shift in the girl's position. When the lights steadied, everything appeared normal, but Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set the image aside. She reached for her laptop and began typing notes about the photograph, but her fingers kept returning to trace the girl's face. Emma Whitmore. The name felt familiar on her tongue, though she was certain she had never encountered it in her research. Sarah made a mental note to search the orphanage records for any mention of the child's disappearance. The basement seemed to grow quieter as the afternoon wore on, the only sounds being the rhythmic patter of rain and the soft clicking of Sarah's keyboard. She photographed Emma's picture with her phone, planning to examine it more closely later, but when she looked at the digital image, something seemed off. The girl's expression appeared different somehow, more intense, more present. Sarah rubbed her eyes, attributing the discrepancy to the poor lighting and her tired state. She had been working long hours, and perhaps her imagination was getting the better of her. But as she packed up her materials for the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she climbed the narrow stairs leading out of the basement, Sarah paused at the landing and looked back. The shadows seemed deeper now, and for a moment, she thought she glimpsed a small figure standing among the boxes. When she blinked, there was nothing there but darkness and the lingering scent of old paper. Sarah locked the basement door behind her and walked through the empty Historical Society building, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Outside, the October evening had settled over Millbrook like a grey shroud, and streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pale circles of light on the rain-slicked pavement. She drove home through the quiet streets, past the town square with its weathered Civil War monument, and the old Methodist church with its towering spire, but her thoughts kept returning to the photograph tucked safely in her research bag. Something about Emma Whitmore's story was calling to her, demanding to be told. That night, as Sarah sat in her rented cottage on the outskirts of town, she spread the photograph on her kitchen table and examined it under the bright overhead light. The girl's face seemed even more haunting in the warm glow of her home, those dark eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her shiver. Sarah opened her laptop and began searching for any mention of Emma Whitmore in the historical records she had access to online. What she found made her blood run cold. According to a brief newspaper article from December 1888, Emma had indeed disappeared from the Millbrook Children's Home on a bitter winter night. The authorities had conducted a search, but no trace of the child was ever found. The article mentioned that Emma had been seen by several residents near the orphanage gates just before her disappearance, standing in the falling snow as if waiting for someone who never came. The last line of the article sent chills through Sarah's entire body. Local residents report the child appeared almost ghostly in the lamplight, as if she were already fading from this world. Sarah stared at the photograph again, and this time she was certain she saw something that hadn't been there before. Behind Emma, in the shadows beyond the gate, stood the outline of a large building with broken windows that seemed to watch like hollow eyes. But more disturbing was the realization that the girl's mouth, which had appeared closed in her earlier examinations, now seemed to be slightly open, as if she were trying to speak across the decades. The wind howled around Sarah's cottage, rattling the windows and making the old structure creak and groan. She carefully placed the photograph back in its protective sleeve, but she knew sleep would not come easily that night. Emma Whitmore had found her way into Sarah's consciousness, and something told her that this was only the beginning of a story that had been waiting 136 years to be told. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into every corner of Millbrook. Sarah had barely slept, her dreams filled with images of hollow-eyed children and iron gates that stretched endlessly upward. She arrived at the Historical Society early, hoping to delve deeper into the records before the building opened to the public. Margaret Thornton, the elderly librarian who had been working at the Historical Society for nearly 40 years, greeted Sarah with a warm smile and a steaming cup of coffee. Margaret's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through the morning's mail. "You look like you didn't get much sleep, dear," Margaret observed, her keen blue eyes studying Sarah's face. "That basement can be quite overwhelming, especially when you're working alone with all those old records." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully and pulled out the photograph of Emma Whitmore. "Margaret, I found this yesterday. Do you know anything about this girl or what happened to her?" Margaret's face went pale as she looked at the photograph, and her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. For a moment she seemed unable to speak, her eyes fixed on Emma's haunting gaze. "Where did you find this?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain pattering against the windows. "In the basement, in a box of materials from the old orphanage. The writing on the back says she disappeared in December 1888. Sarah watched Margaret's reaction carefully, noting the older woman's obvious distress. Margaret walked to the window and stared out at the grey morning, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that place," she said finally. "The Millbrook Children's Home. She said it was cursed, that terrible things happened there long before it was finally shut down in 1923. "What kind of terrible things?" Sarah pressed gently. "Children disappearing, mostly. Always in winter, always the youngest ones." Margaret turned back to face Sarah, and there was fear in her eyes now. "My grandmother swore she saw things near the old orphanage grounds. Shadows that moved wrong, voices calling out in the night. She said the place was hungry for children's souls." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Have there been any recent sightings? Any strange occurrences around the old orphanage site?" Margaret hesitated, clearly debating whether to share something. Finally, she walked to her desk and pulled out a manila folder. "3 weeks ago, Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street called the police. She said she saw a little girl standing at the old orphanage gates at twilight, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress and apron. Did the police investigate? Officer Martinez went to check it out, but by the time he arrived, there was no one there. Mrs. Henderson insisted the child had been real, though. She said the girl was just standing there, perfectly still, like she was waiting for someone." Margaret paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Henderson is 83 years old and sharp as a tack. She's lived in this town her entire life, and she's never been one for flights of fancy." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Has anyone else reported similar sightings?" 2 more calls came in over the past month. Both described the same thing: a young girl in old-fashioned clothing near the orphanage grounds. One caller said the child appeared to be crying, but when they approached to help, she vanished into thin air. The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Sarah stared at Emma's photograph, and she could swear the girl's expression had changed again, becoming more urgent, more desperate. "Margaret, I need to visit the old orphanage site. Can you give me directions?" The older woman looked troubled. "It's about 2 miles north of town on Sorrow Hill Road, but Sarah, I don't think it's wise to go there alone, especially not with these recent sightings. That place has a darkness about it that seems to draw people in." Despite Margaret's warnings, Sarah knew she had to see the site for herself. After spending the morning reviewing additional orphanage records that yielded few new details about Emma's disappearance, She drove through the winding streets of Millbrook towards Sorrow Hill Road. The road climbed steadily upward, flanked by dense woods that seemed to press in on both sides. Ancient oak and maple trees created a canopy so thick that even the grey afternoon light struggled to penetrate it. As Sarah's car rounded a bend, the trees suddenly opened up to reveal a wrought iron fence, partially collapsed with age and neglect. She parked at the side of the road and approached the gates on foot. They were massive structures, easily 12 feet tall, with intricate metalwork that had once been beautiful, but was now twisted and rusted by decades of weather. Between the bars, Sarah could see the remains of a large brick building, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in ivy that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The silence here was absolute, as if the very air had grown thick with the weight of forgotten tragedies. Sarah pulled out her phone to take photographs, but as she raised the device, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by the shadows of the overhanging trees, was a small figure. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. A young girl in a grey dress and white apron stood perfectly still, her dark hair hanging limply around her pale face. Sarah blinked, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her, but when she looked again, the figure was still there. The girl appeared to be staring directly at her, and even from this distance Sarah could feel the intensity of that gaze. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely in the stillness. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. She simply stood there like a statue, her small hands hanging at her sides. Sarah took a tentative step forward, and then another, but as she moved closer, the figure began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. By the time Sarah reached the spot where the girl had been standing, there was nothing there but dead leaves, and the lingering scent of something old and sorrowful. Sarah looked around frantically, searching for any sign that someone had been there, but the ground showed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. Her hands shaking, Sarah pulled out Emma's photograph and compared it to what she had just seen. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same dark hair, the same small stature, the same haunting presence. But that was impossible. The photograph was 136 years old. As if responding to her thoughts, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, but when she looked at the screen, her blood ran cold. The message showed only a date and time, December 15th, 1888, 11:47 p.m., followed by a single word that made her knees weak. Help. The message had no sender, no number attached to it. It was as if it had materialized from thin air. Sarah stared at the screen until it went dark, then looked up to find that fog was beginning to roll in from the woods, creating ghostly shapes that danced between the trees. She hurried back to her car, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Whatever was happening here went far beyond historical research. Emma Whitmore was more than just a name in an old record. She was reaching across time itself, trying to communicate with the living world. As Sarah drove back toward town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. In her rearview mirror, the fog seemed to move with unnatural purpose, and she could swear she glimpsed a small figure walking along the roadside, matching the speed of her car with impossible ease. She didn't slow down until she reached the bright lights of downtown Millbrook, but even then the chill of that encounter remained with her like a shadow that refused to be shaken. Sarah spent a restless night researching everything she could find about supernatural communications and historical hauntings, but nothing prepared her for what she would discover the next day. She arrived at the Historical Society to find Margaret waiting for her with a troubled expression and a fresh pot of coffee that smelled like salvation. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's workspace. "There are people in this town who remember more than what's written in the official records. If you're serious about understanding what happened to that little girl, you need to talk to the old-timers." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been staring at the mysterious text message for the 100th time. "Who would you recommend?" "Start with Henry Blackwood. He's 92 years old and sharp as a razor. His grandfather was the groundskeeper at the orphanage from 1885 until it closed. Henry grew up hearing stories that never made it into any newspaper." Margaret paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "And then there's Eleanor Marsh. She's 88 and lives in the old Victorian house on Elm Street. Her great-aunt worked as a nurse at the orphanage." Within an hour, Sarah found herself standing on the wraparound porch of Henry Blackwood's modest colonial home on the outskirts of town. The old man who answered the door was tall and lean, with piercing grey eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His white hair was carefully combed, and despite his age, he moved with surprising agility. "For you're the historian Margaret called about," he said, gesturing for her to come inside. "She said you found something that's got the whole town stirred up." Henry's living room was filled with antique furniture and old photographs that chronicled Millbrook's history. Sarah showed him Emma's photograph, and she watched as his weathered face grew grave. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, holding the image closer to examine it. "I haven't seen this picture in decades, but I remember my grandfather describing it. He said this was taken the day before Emma vanished, and that everyone at the orphanage knew something terrible was about to happen." "What did your grandfather tell you about that night?" Henry set the photograph down carefully and walked to his mantel, where he retrieved a leather-bound journal. He kept detailed records of everything that happened at that place. Said someone needed to remember the truth, even if the official reports were lies. He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read in a voice heavy with years of carrying dark secrets. December 15th, 1888. "The girl Emma has been standing at the gates for 3 days now, refusing to come inside even when the snow began to fall. She keeps saying she's waiting for her mother to return, but her mother died of consumption 2 years ago. Director Holbrook grows more agitated with each passing hour. He's been drinking heavily again, and I fear what he might do if his patience finally breaks." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Director Holbrook?" "Ezra Holbrook. He ran the orphanage with an iron fist and a taste for cruelty that would make the devil himself sick. My grandfather suspected him of far worse than just harsh discipline, but in those days, who would listen to the word of a groundskeeper against a man of Holbrook standing in the community?" Henry turned several pages and continued reading. "December 16th, 1888. Emma is gone. Director Holbrook claims she ran away in the night, but I found drops of blood on the snow near the gates. When I tried to show them to the constable, Holbrook said the girl had cut herself on the iron bars trying to escape. The other children are terrified, whispering that they heard screaming from the director's office last night. Did your grandfather ever find out what really happened to her?" The old man's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of his cozy living room. He suspected the truth, but he could never prove it. 3 more children disappeared over the next 5 years, always in winter, always the ones who asked too many questions or fought back against Holbrook's discipline. My grandfather finally quit in 1893, but he never stopped watching that place. Henry closed the journal and looked directly at Sarah. The last entry he made about the orphanage was in 1923, the year it finally closed. He wrote that on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, you could still hear children crying from inside those empty buildings. Sarah's next stop was Eleanor Marsh's Victorian home, a beautiful but somewhat decrepit structure surrounded by an overgrown garden that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. Eleanor was a tiny woman, with bright blue eyes and silver hair that she wore in an elaborate bun secured with antique pins. "I've been expecting you," Eleanor said before Sarah could even introduce herself. "Word travels fast in a small town, especially when someone starts asking questions about things that have been buried for over a century." Eleanor's parlor was like stepping into a museum filled with delicate china, lace doilies, and photographs spanning multiple generations. She served tea from a set that looked like it belonged in a palace, her movements precise despite her advanced age. "My great-aunt Millicent was the head nurse at the orphanage from 1886 to 1889, Eleanor began, settling into a wingback chair that seemed to dwarf her small frame. "She left rather suddenly after Emma disappeared, and she never spoke of her time there until she was on her deathbed." "What did she tell you?" Eleanor's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. "She said Director Holbrook had a special interest in the younger children, particularly the girls who had no family left to ask questions about their welfare. Emma was one of his favorites, which made her situation all the more dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Aunt Millicent suspected that Holbrook was selling children to wealthy families who couldn't have children of their own, or worse, to people who had no business being around children at all. The official records would show that a child had run away or died of illness, but the truth was far more sinister. Eleanor rose and walked to an ornate secretary desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a small wooden box that she opened to reveal a collection of letters tied with a black ribbon. "These are letters Aunt Millicent wrote but never sent, documenting everything she witnessed at the orphanage. She was too frightened to mail them while she was alive, but she made me promise to keep them safe." Eleanor handed one of the letters to Sarah. "This one is about Emma. Sarah unfolded the yellowed paper with trembling hands and read the careful script that chronicled a nurse's growing horror at what she was witnessing. The letter described how Emma had become increasingly agitated in the days before her disappearance, claiming that someone was coming to take her away to a place where children were never seen again. According to Millicent's account, Emma had begged to be allowed to wait at the gates because she believed her dead mother's spirit would protect her there. The nurse had found the child's faith touching, but ultimately futile against the evil that lurked within the orphanage walls. The letter's final paragraph made Sarah's hands shake. "I fear that dear Emma's vigil at the gates was not enough to save her from Director Holbrook's plans. On the night she disappeared, I heard her screaming from his office, but when I tried to intervene, I was told she had already fled into the storm." The blood on the snow told a different story, one that I am too frightened to speak aloud, but too horrified to forget. As Sarah finished reading, Eleanor leaned forward with an intensity that belied her age. Aunt Millicent also wrote about strange occurrences after Emma's disappearance. Other children reported seeing her in the hallways at night, always wearing that same apron, always crying for her mother. The sightings became so frequent that Holbrook had the children beaten for spreading what he called hysteria and lies. "Do you think Emma's spirit never left the orphanage?" Eleanor's blue eyes grew sharp and knowing. "I think that child's death was so violent, so unjust, that her soul became trapped in that place, and I think she's been trying to tell her story for 136 years, waiting for someone brave enough to listen and strong enough to help her find peace." As Sarah drove home through the darkening streets of Millbrook, she felt the weight of Emma's story settling around her like a heavy cloak. The truth was beginning to emerge from decades of silence and deliberate cover-ups, painting a picture of corruption and cruelty that made her stomach turn. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that Emma's appearances weren't random hauntings. They were a desperate plea for justice, a call for someone to finally expose the truth about what had happened within the walls of the Millbrook Children's Home. The question now was whether Sarah had the courage to answer that call, knowing that the forces that had silenced Emma once might not hesitate to strike again. That evening, Sarah sat in her cottage kitchen, surrounded by photocopies of historical documents, witness testimonies, and Emma's haunting photograph. The pieces of a horrific puzzle were beginning to come together, but she knew she needed more concrete evidence to understand the full scope of what had happened at the Millbrook Children's Home. Her phone buzzed with another mysterious message. This time, instead of a date, she found an address. 47 Birch Lane, basement, behind the furnace. The message vanished from her screen before she could screenshot it, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. Sarah grabbed her laptop and searched for 47 Birch Lane. The property records showed it as the former residence of Ezra Holbrook, built in 1882 and currently owned by the Millbrook Historical Preservation Trust. The house had been empty for years, awaiting restoration funds that never seemed to materialize. Unable to shake the feeling that Emma was trying to guide her to something important, Sarah decided to visit the house the next morning. She called Margaret first, explaining that she needed access to research Director Holbrook's personal effects. "That old place gives me the shivers," Margaret admitted, "but I suppose if anyone should see what's in there, it should be a historian. I'll meet you there at 10 o'clock with the keys." The Holbrook house sat on a tree-lined street that had once been the most prestigious address in Millbrook. The Victorian mansion was a monument to decay, its paint peeling like diseased skin, and its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Broken shutters hung at odd angles, and the windows stared out like dead eyes. Margaret arrived precisely at 10, her face pale and drawn. "I've only been inside once before," she said, fumbling with an old brass key. "The Historical Society inherited everything when the last of Holbrook's descendants died in 1987. Most of his papers are stored in the basement." The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty house. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of weak sunlight that struggled through grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Sarah's stomach turn. "The basement door is through the kitchen," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. They made their way through rooms filled with sheet-covered furniture that looked like sleeping ghosts. The kitchen was a relic from the 1880s, with a massive cast-iron stove and a hand pump over a deep porcelain sink. The basement door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Margaret's hand shook as she reached for the light switch. "I'll wait upstairs," she said quickly. "Call if you need anything." Sarah descended the wooden stairs alone, each step creaking ominously under her weight. The basement was larger than she had expected, with stone walls that wept moisture and a dirt floor that felt soft and uncertain beneath her feet. Cardboard boxes and wooden crates lined the walls, and in the far corner stood an enormous coal furnace that dominated the space like a sleeping monster. Following the mysterious message's instructions, Sarah made her way to the area behind the furnace. At first she saw nothing unusual, just more boxes and the accumulated debris of decades. But as she moved closer, she noticed that one section of the stone wall looked different from the rest. The mortar between certain stones appeared newer, as if they had been removed and replaced at some point. Sarah pulled out her phone's flashlight and examined the wall more closely. Her heart began to race as she realized what she was looking at. Someone had created a hidden compartment behind a false section of wall, and the mortar holding it in place was crumbling with age. She looked around for something to use as a tool and found an old crowbar among the scattered debris. Working carefully, she began to chip away at the loose mortar. After several minutes of careful work, she was able to remove several stones, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. Inside the hidden compartment, Sarah found a leather satchel that had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Her hands trembled as she opened it to discover a collection of documents that would change everything she thought she knew about the Millbrook Children's Home. The first item was a ledger, written in Director Holbrook's own hand. The entries were coded, but as Sarah studied them, a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. Each entry contained a child's name, age, and what appeared to be a monetary amount. Some entries were marked with the letter S, and others with D, and Emma Whitmore's name appeared on the very last page. Beneath the ledger, Sarah found correspondence between Holbrook and various individuals whose names she didn't recognize. The letters were carefully worded, but their meaning was unmistakable. Holbrook had been running a sophisticated operation, selling children to wealthy families who asked no questions about where their new sons and daughters came from. But the letters marked with D told an even darker story. These children weren't being adopted. They were being sold to individuals with far more sinister intentions. The correspondence spoke of special arrangements and private collectors who were willing to pay premium prices for children who would never be missed. Sarah's hands shook as she read a letter dated December 10th, 1888, just 5 days before Emma's disappearance. Mr. Holbrook, my client is very pleased with your previous arrangements and would like to secure another subject for his collection. He has specific requirements. Female between 8 and 10 years of age with dark hair and pale complexion. The subject must be completely without family connections, as my client values absolute discretion. Payment will be made upon delivery as previously arranged. J. Morrison, attorney at law. At the bottom of the satchel, Sarah found something that made her gasp aloud. It was a small daguerreotype photograph showing Emma Whitmore, but this image was different from the one she had found at the Historical Society. In this picture, Emma was not standing at the orphanage gates. Instead, she was sitting in what appeared to be Holbrook's office, her eyes wide with terror and her hands bound behind her back. Written on the back of this photograph in Holbrook's spidery handwriting were the words, "Final delivery, December 15th, 1888. Payment received in full. Subject disposed of per client instructions." Sarah's vision blurred as the full horror of what she was reading sank in. Emma hadn't run away from the orphanage. She hadn't even been sold into slavery or illegal adoption. She had been murdered, killed by whatever monster had purchased her from Holbrook for reasons too terrible to contemplate. As if responding to her discovery, the basement suddenly grew ice cold. Sarah's breath began to fog in the frigid air, and she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs behind her. She spun around to see a small figure descending into the basement, her grey dress and white apron clearly visible in the dim light. Emma Whitmore walked towards Sarah with slow, deliberate steps, her dark eyes fixed on the documents in Sarah's hands. As she drew closer, Sarah could see that the child's throat had been cut, a gaping wound that should have been mortal, but somehow allowed her to continue moving, continue seeking justice for what had been done to her. "I waited," Emma said, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from very far away. "I waited at the gates because Mama told me to never go with strangers, but he made me go anyway." Sarah's heart broke as she looked at this tortured spirit, this child who had been failed by every adult who should have protected her. "I'm going to help you," she whispered. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what really happened to you." Emma nodded slowly, and for just a moment her terrible wound seemed to heal, her face taking on the peaceful expression of a child who finally felt safe. "He's still here," she said, her voice growing fainter. He never left. And there are others like me, others who are still waiting. Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Emma began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. Within moments she had vanished completely, leaving only the lingering scent of old roses and the echo of her words. Find the others. Free us all. Sarah carefully packed the documents back into the satchel, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. Emma's murder had not been an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of corruption and evil that had continued for years. But Emma's final words suggested something even more disturbing. If Holbrook was somehow still here after more than a century, then the evil that had consumed the Millbrook children's home might not have died with him. And if there were other victims, other children whose spirits were trapped and waiting for justice, then Sarah's investigation was far from over. As she climbed the basement stairs with the satchel clutched tightly to her chest, Sarah knew that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She was no longer just researching history. She was waging war against forces that had been hiding in the shadows for over a century, forces that would not give up their secrets without a fight. Sarah spent the rest of the day in her cottage, carefully documenting every piece of evidence she had found in Holbrook's basement. The implications of Emma's final words haunted her. If there were other children, other spirits trapped and seeking justice, then the scope of this horror was far greater than she had imagined. She spread out copies of Holbrook's ledger on her kitchen table and began cross-referencing the coded entries with historical records. What she discovered made her stomach churn. Between 1885 and 1892, at least 12 children had vanished from the Millbrook Children's Home. The official records claimed they had either run away or died of various illnesses, but Holbrook's secret ledger told a different story. Each child's name appeared with a monetary amount and either an S or D designation. Sarah was beginning to understand that S meant sold, children who had been trafficked to families or individuals who wanted them alive. But D clearly meant something far more sinister, and 5 children, including Emma, bore that terrible mark. As darkness fell over Millbrook, Sarah noticed that the temperature in her cottage had begun to drop steadily, despite the heating system running at full capacity. Frost began to form on the inside of her windows, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like children's drawings. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the same time that had appeared in the mysterious text message, Sarah heard voices outside her cottage, children's voices, calling out in the darkness with words she couldn't quite understand. She moved to the window and peered out into the night, her breath fogging the glass as the temperature continued to plummet. In the pale light of the street lamps, Sarah saw them. 5 small figures stood in her front yard, their old-fashioned clothing clearly visible despite the late hour. They were holding hands in a circle, their faces turned upward toward her window. Even from this distance, she could see that each child bore the unmistakable signs of violent death. Emma stood in the center of the circle, her throat wound visible as a dark line across her pale neck. To her left was a boy who couldn't have been more than 7. His skull caved in on one side. A girl of perhaps 10 stood with her back bent at an unnatural angle, while another boy bore burn marks across his small face and hands. The 5th child, a girl with long blonde hair, appeared to have drowned. Her dress was soaked through and water dripped constantly from her lifeless form, creating puddles that steamed in the frigid air. Sarah grabbed her phone to call someone, anyone, but realized there was no one who would believe what she was seeing. Instead, she opened her door and stepped out onto the porch, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. "I see you," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I know what happened to all of you." Emma broke away from the circle and approached the porch, her bare feet making no sound on the frost-covered grass. "You found his papers," she said, her child's voice somehow carrying the weight of more than a century of pain. "You know the truth now." "Tell me about the others," Sarah whispered, wrapping her arms around herself as the cold penetrated her bones. "Help me understand what I need to do." Emma gestured to the boy with the crushed skull. "That's Timothy. He was only 6 when Holbrook killed him for asking too many questions about where the other children went. The man who bought him wanted to study how children's minds worked when they were scared." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced herself to listen as Emma continued. "Mary there was sold to a woman who collected pretty little girls and kept them in glass cases in her parlor. When Mary tried to escape, the woman broke her spine to make sure she could never run again." The burned boy stepped forward, his damaged face a map of unimaginable suffering. "I'm Peter," he said in a voice like autumn leaves. "The man who bought me liked to experiment with fire. He wanted to see how long children could survive being burned. Sarah's legs nearly gave out, but she gripped the porch railing and forced herself to remain standing. The blonde girl approached next, water still streaming from her hair and dress. "I'm Alice," she said, her voice gurgling as if she was speaking from underwater. "My buyer had a special pond in his estate where he would hold children under the water to watch them drown. He said we looked like angels when we stopped struggling." The final child, Mary with the broken spine, spoke in a whisper that cut through the night like a blade. "We've been waiting so long for someone to hear our stories. Holbrook promised each buyer that no one would ever come looking for us, that we were already forgotten, but we remember everything." Emma took another step closer to the porch. "Holbrook didn't just disappear when the orphanage closed, Sarah. His spirit is bound to this place just like ours are, but for different reasons. He feeds on our pain, grows stronger from our suffering. As long as he remains, we can never find peace." "Where is he?" Sarah asked. "How do I find him?" "He hides in the place where it all began," Timothy said, his small voice filled with ancient rage. "In the basement of the orphanage where he kept his special room, the room where he would prepare us for delivery to our buyers." Alice stepped forward, water pooling at her feet. "But you can't face him alone, Sarah. He's had more than a century to grow strong, to feed on the darkness he created. He'll try to stop you from exposing the truth." "He's already started," Peter added, gesturing to the frost that was spreading across Sarah's porch. "He knows you have his papers, knows you've spoken with us. He'll use every trick he learned in life and death to protect his secrets." Emma reached out as if to touch Sarah's hand, and Sarah felt a cold that went deeper than winter, deeper than death itself. "We can help you, but only if you're brave enough to enter his domain, only if you're willing to risk everything to set us free." Sarah looked at each of the children in turn, seeing not just the victims they had become, but the innocent souls they had once been. These were children who had died alone and afraid, sold by the very person who should have protected them, murdered by monsters who saw them as objects rather than human beings. "What do I need to do?" Sarah asked. "Return to the orphanage tomorrow night," Emma said. "Bring his papers as proof of what he did. We'll be waiting for you there, but remember, once you enter that building, once you confront Holbrook's spirit, there's no guarantee any of us will survive what comes next." "If I don't survive," Sarah said quietly, "if something happens to me, I've hidden copies of all the evidence where they'll be found. The truth will come out either way." Emma smiled for the first time since Sarah had encountered her, and for a moment, she looked like the innocent 9-year-old she should have been allowed to remain. "You're the first person in 136 years to treat us like we mattered," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already given us something we thought we'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope." As the first hints of dawn began to appear on the horizon, the children began to fade like smoke in the wind. Emma was the last to disappear, her dark eyes holding Sarah's gaze until the very end. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, as she became transparent. "Don't let us wait any longer." Sarah stood alone on her porch as the sun rose over Millbrook, the evidence of the children's visit already melting away with the frost, but their words remained burned into her memory, along with the terrible knowledge of what she would have to do. Tomorrow night, she would return to the place where it all began. Tomorrow night, she would face the evil that had destroyed so many innocent lives. And tomorrow night, she would either free 5 tortured souls or join them in their eternal vigil for justice. Either way, the truth would finally be told. Sarah spent the following day in a state of focused determination, making careful preparations for what she knew would be the most dangerous night of her life. She digitized every document from Holbrook's satchel, uploading copies to multiple cloud storage accounts, and emailing detailed summaries to her colleagues at 3 different universities. If something happened to her tonight, if she didn't return from the orphanage, the truth about Emma and the other children would still come to light. Their stories would finally be told, their murders finally acknowledged and mourned by the world that had forgotten them. She returned to the Historical Society one last time, finding Margaret organizing files in the main reading room. The elderly librarian looked up as Sarah approached, and the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. "You look like someone preparing for battle," Margaret observed, setting down her work. "What did you find in that basement yesterday?" Sarah pulled out photocopies of some of the less disturbing documents from Holbrook's collection. She watched Margaret's face grow pale as she read through the evidence of the director's crimes. "Dear God," Margaret whispered, her hands trembling as she set the papers aside. "All those children, all these years, we thought they had just run away or died of illness." "Margaret, I need you to promise me something," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "If I don't come back tomorrow, if something happens to me tonight, make sure these documents get to the police and the media. Make sure everyone knows what really happened at the Millbrook Children's Home." Margaret's blue eyes widened with alarm. "Sarah, what are you planning to do? Where are you going tonight?" "I'm going to finish what I started. I'm going to make sure those children finally get justice." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are things about this case that go beyond historical research, Margaret. Forces at work that most people wouldn't understand or believe." "You're talking about the supernatural, aren't you?" Margaret said quietly. "About the spirits people have been seeing around the old orphanage." Sarah nodded. "Emma and the other children who were murdered are trapped there, unable to find peace until the truth is exposed and their killer is finally stopped. I know it sounds impossible, but I've seen them, spoken with them. They're real and they need my help." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the sharp intelligence that had made her such a valuable keeper of the town's history. Finally, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small silver cross on a chain. "This was my grandmother's," she said, fastening it around Sarah's neck. "She always said it protected her from the darkness that lurked in old places. I don't know if it will help against whatever you're facing tonight, but I want you to have it." Sarah touched the cross, feeling its weight against her chest, like a small anchor of hope. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." As evening approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She packed a flashlight, spare batteries, her phone, and most importantly, Holbrook's original documents in a waterproof bag. She also included a small digital recorder, hoping to capture evidence of whatever she might encounter in the orphanage. She drove through Millbrook one last time as the sun set, taking in the peaceful streets and normal suburban homes where families were settling in for another ordinary evening. None of them knew that just a few miles away, 5 murdered children were waiting for someone brave enough to confront the evil that had destroyed their lives. The old orphanage looked even more forbidding in the gathering darkness. Sarah parked at the side of Sorrow Hill Road and approached the rusted gates on foot, her flashlight cutting through the shadows that seemed to press in from all sides. The building beyond the fence loomed like a monument to suffering, its broken windows and crumbling walls testimony to decades of neglect and deliberate forgetting. As Sarah reached for the gate, she heard them before she saw them. 5 young voices singing a lullaby that sounded familiar yet wrong, the melody twisted into something mournful and strange. The children materialized one by one in the overgrown courtyard beyond the gate, their forms more solid than she had ever seen them before. Emma stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting the beam of Sarah's flashlight. "You came," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she had feared that Sarah might abandon them at the last moment. "I promised I would," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "How do we get inside?" Timothy, the boy with the crushed skull, pointed toward a section of the building where part of the wall had collapsed. "There's a way in through the old kitchen, but Sarah, once we cross the threshold, Holbrook will know we're there. He'll try to stop us before we can reach his special room." "What can he do to me?" Sarah asked. Alice, still dripping with supernatural water, answered with chilling honesty. "He can make you see things that aren't there, hear voices that will drive you mad. He can make the building itself turn against you, trap you in rooms that don't exist, or make you lose your way in corridors that lead nowhere." Peter, his burned face grotesque in the flashlight beam, added, "He'll try to make you afraid, Sarah. Fear is what feeds him, what makes him strong. But if you can hold on to your purpose, if you can remember why you're here, you might be able to resist his influence." Mary, her spine bent at that impossible angle, spoke in a whisper that seemed to come from very far away. "The special room is in the basement, beneath what used to be his office. That's where he would prepare us for our buyers, where he would condition us to be more compliant." Sarah felt sick at the implication, but she forced herself to focus on the task ahead. "What do I need to do once I get there?" Emma held up her small pale hand. "You need to read his crimes aloud from his own documents. Call out the names of everyone he murdered. You need to bear witness to what he did. Acknowledge our suffering. Only then will his hold over this place be broken. And if I succeed, then we'll be free to move on to whatever comes next," Emma said, her voice filled with longing. "And Holbrook's spirit will be banished, unable to hurt any more children. And if I fail," the children exchanged glances, and Sarah saw the truth in their spectral faces before Emma spoke the words that confirmed her worst fears. "Then you'll join us here, trapped forever by the evil he created, and the cycle will continue. More children will disappear, and the truth will remain buried for another century. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Margaret's cross against her chest and the importance of the documents in her bag. She thought of all the children who had suffered and died because adults had failed to protect them, because evil had been allowed to flourish in the shadows. "Then we'd better make sure I don't fail," she said, stepping through the gap in the rusted gate. As soon as her feet touched the orphanage grounds, the temperature plummeted and a wind began to howl through the ruins with unnatural fury. The building seemed to pulse with malevolent life, its broken windows glowing with a sickly light that had no earthly source. "He knows we're here," Emma said, her voice barely audible above the supernatural storm that was building around them. "Stay close to us, Sarah. Don't let him separate you from your purpose." Together, the living historian and 5 dead children began their approach to the building, where one man's greed and cruelty had created a wound in the fabric of reality itself. Sarah gripped her flashlight tighter and thought of Margaret's words about protection from darkness. Tonight she would need all the protection she could get. The collapsed section of the kitchen wall gaped before them, like a wound in the building's flesh. Sarah climbed through the rubble with the 5 children's spirits moving silently beside her, their forms flickering between solid and translucent as the supernatural storm raged around the orphanage. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying, that reminded Sarah of flowers left too long in a vase. Her flashlight beam revealed a scene of deliberate destruction, as if the building itself had been trying to forget what had happened within its walls. The kitchen was a ruin of collapsed shelving and overturned furniture, but Sarah could still make out the massive cast-iron stove where meals had been prepared for dozens of children. Rust stains on the floor looked disturbingly like dried blood, and scratch marks on the walls suggested desperate attempts to claw away from unspeakable horrors. "The children used to hide in here when Holbrook was looking for his next victim," Emma whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the ruined space. "They thought the kitchen staff might protect them, but everyone was too afraid to stand up to him." As they moved deeper into the building, Sarah began to understand the true scope of Holbrook's operation. The orphanage had been designed like a maze, with multiple corridors and hidden passages that would have made it easy to move children without being seen by visitors or potential witnesses. Timothy pointed down a hallway that seemed to stretch impossibly far into the darkness. His office was at the end of that corridor. "But Sarah, don't trust what you see. Holbrook is already trying to confuse you to make you lose your way." Sarah looked down the hallway and felt her heart skip a beat. The corridor appeared to be moving, the walls breathing in and out, like the ribs of some enormous beast. Doors along the sides opened and closed of their own accord, revealing glimpses of rooms that couldn't possibly exist in a building this size. "Focus on us," Mary said, her broken spine causing her to move with an unsettling, jerky gait. "Don't look at the walls, don't listen to the voices. Keep your eyes on us and we'll guide you through his illusions." As they began walking down the corridor, Sarah heard them, the voices Mary had warned her about. Children crying, calling out for help that would never come. Adult voices too, cold and calculating, discussing transactions that made her stomach turn. "Excellent specimen, Director. My client will be very pleased with this acquisition. The younger ones are always more valuable. They haven't learned to fight back yet. Make sure there are no marks visible on the merchandise. My buyer prefers them pristine." Sarah gritted her teeth and forced herself to keep walking, following the spectral forms of Emma and the others through the shifting nightmare that Holbrook's presence had created. The walls around them began to show scenes from the orphanage's dark past, children huddled in corners, Holbrook selecting his next victim, and worst of all, the moments of final terror as each child realized their fate. "Don't watch," Alice said urgently, water streaming from her hair as she moved. "He's trying to overwhelm you with horror to make you give up and run. That's how he survived for so long, by making people too afraid to face the truth." But even as Alice spoke, the images on the walls became more vivid, more real. Sarah saw Emma standing at the orphanage gates, not knowing that Holbrook was already planning her murder. She saw Timothy asking innocent questions about where his friends had gone, unaware that his curiosity would cost him his life. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, and Sarah began to wonder if they were trapped in some kind of supernatural loop. But then Peter, his burned face determined despite the pain it must have caused him to exist in this state, pointed to a door that hadn't been there moments before. "There," he said, "that's his office. But Sarah, the door won't open for you. It will only open for him." "What do you mean?" Emma turned to face her, and Sarah saw something in the child's dark eyes that she hadn't noticed before, a spark of the fierce intelligence that had made her such a threat to Holbrook's operation. "You have to call him," Emma said. "You have to speak his name and challenge him directly. Only then will he emerge from whatever dark corner he's been hiding in all these years." Sarah approached the door, which appeared to be made of solid oak with brass fittings that gleamed despite the building's overall decay. She placed her hand on the handle and felt it burn with supernatural cold. "Ezra Holbrook," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the supernatural silence that had fallen over the corridor. "I know what you did. I have proof of your crimes. Come out and face me." The temperature around them plummeted even further, and Sarah's breath formed clouds of vapor in the frigid air. The door handle turned slowly under her hand, and the oak panel swung open to reveal an office that belonged to another time entirely. The room beyond was exactly as it had been in 1888, down to the papers scattered across Holbrook's massive mahogany desk and the oil lamp burning with a flame that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Behind the desk sat a figure that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. Ezra Holbrook looked exactly as he had in life, a tall, thin man with graying hair and eyes that held no warmth, no humanity. He wore a black suit with a high collar, and his pale hands were folded calmly on the desk as if he had been expecting her arrival. "Dr. Sarah Chen," he said, his voice carrying the educated accent of 19th-century New England aristocracy. "The meddlesome historian who thinks she can undo more than a century of careful work. You have something that belongs to me." "I have the truth," Sarah replied, surprised by her own steadiness. "I have evidence of what you did to these children, and I'm going to make sure the world knows about your crimes." Holbrook smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any scream. "My dear woman, you have stumbled into forces far beyond your understanding. Those children were merchandise, nothing more. They had no families, no futures, no value to anyone but the clients I served. I gave their worthless lives meaning." "You murdered them," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger. "You sold them to monsters and killers for money." "I provided a service," Holbrook corrected, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "There are people in this world with very specific needs, very particular tastes. I simply facilitated transactions that benefited everyone involved." "Everyone except the children," Holbrook waved his hand dismissively. "Children die every day, Dr. Chen. Disease, accidents, neglect. What difference does it make how they meet their end? At least my clients were willing to pay premium prices for the privilege of determining how those deaths occurred." Sarah felt rage building in her chest, a fury so pure and hot that it seemed to push back against the supernatural cold surrounding them. She pulled out Holbrook's documents and held them up so he could see them clearly. "I'm going to read every name," she said. "I'm going to tell the world exactly what you did to each of these children. Your legacy won't be forgotten wealth or successful business. It will be the truth about the monster you were." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Holbrook's pale features. "Those documents are mine," he said, his voice losing some of its confident edge. "You have no right to them." "I have every right," Sarah replied. "These children have been waiting 136 years for someone to speak for them. Tonight their voices will finally be heard." She opened the first document and began to read aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the spectral office and beyond, into every corner of the orphanage where evil had once held sway. "Emma Whitmore, age 9. Sold for $300 to a collector who specialized in the torture and murder of young girls. Killed December 15th, 1888. As Sarah spoke Emma's name, the little girl's spirit became more solid, more present, and Holbrook actually took a step backward from his desk. Timothy Morrison, age 6. Sold for $200 to a man who conducted fatal experiments on children's minds. Murdered January 3rd, 1889. Timothy's form blazed with spectral light, and Holbrook's confident expression began to crack like old paint. Sarah continued reading, speaking each child's name and fate with the solemnity of a prayer for the dead. With each name, each revelation of horror, the murdered children became stronger, while Holbrook seemed to diminish. But the director wasn't finished yet. As Sarah reached the final entry in his ledger, he raised his hands and the office around them began to shake with supernatural fury. "Enough!" he roared, his civilized mask finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "You will not destroy what I have built. You will join them in servitude, and my work will continue." The walls of the office began to close in, and Sarah realized that her real test was just beginning. The walls of Holbrook's office crashed inward, like the jaws of some enormous predator, but just as they were about to crush Sarah, Emma's spirit blazed with brilliant light, and the crushing walls stopped mere inches from Sarah's face. "He's trying to trap you," Emma said, her child's voice now carrying an authority that seemed to come from beyond the grave. "But he can't hurt you as long as you keep speaking our names. Our stories are his weakness, Sarah. Every word of truth makes him smaller." Holbrook snarled and gestured toward a door that materialized behind his desk, a door that led downward into darkness, deeper than any earthly basement could contain. "You want the truth so badly," he hissed, his cultured accent slipping to reveal something older and more primitive underneath. "Then come to my special room, where I prepared each of them for their final purpose. Come and see what I really did to your precious children." Sarah felt every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee this place and never look back. But the 5 murdered children stood beside her, their spectral forms glowing with hope for the first time in over a century. "We have to go down there," Timothy said, his crushed skull somehow less horrific now that his spirit was growing stronger. "That's where it really happened, where he broke us before selling us to our killers. That's where his power is centered." The narrow staircase descended into a darkness so complete that Sarah's flashlight seemed to barely penetrate it. With each step downward, the air grew thicker, more oppressive, carrying scents that spoke of unspeakable horrors, fear, sweat, blood, and the lingering traces of children's tears. The basement beneath Holbrook's office was larger than should have been possible, extending far beyond the building's foundation. The walls were lined with what appeared to be medical equipment from the 1880s, restraining tables, surgical instruments, and apparatus designed not for healing, but for inflicting precise amounts of pain and terror. But it was the photographs covering every inch of the walls that made Sarah's knees nearly buckle, hundreds of images showing children in various stages of preparation for their buyers, posed, arranged, and documented like livestock being readied for market. Each photograph bore a price tag and detailed notes about the child's specifications and marketable qualities. "This is where he would bring us," Mary whispered, her broken spine causing her to move with jerky, unnatural motions. "He would tell us we were being prepared for adoption by loving families, but the preparations were different than what you would expect." Alice pointed to a corner where chains still hung from the walls, sized for small wrists and ankles. "He would keep us here for days sometimes, conditioning us to be compliant, teaching us not to scream or fight back. He said our buyers preferred children who had learned to be quiet." Peter's burned face showed no emotion as he gestured toward a collection of branding irons arranged on a table like surgical instruments. "He would mark us with his buyer's initials before delivery. He said it helped prevent us from being returned or resold to competitors." Sarah felt sick to her core, but she forced herself to continue reading from Holbrook's documents. Each name she spoke seemed to cause the director's spirit visible pain, making him writhe and diminish, while the children grew brighter and more present. "But the names aren't enough," Emma said, her dark eyes fixed on Holbrook as he retreated deeper into the shadows of his special room. "You have to read what he wrote about each of us, what he told his buyers we could be used for. Only then will everyone understand the full scope of his evil." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the most horrific document in Holbrook's collection, a catalogue he had created for his wealthy clients, describing each child's qualities and potential applications in language so clinical and dehumanizing that it was almost incomprehensible. "Emma Whitmore," she read, her voice growing stronger with each word. 9 years old, dark hair, pale complexion, recommended for clients interested in extended psychological experimentation. Subject, shows exceptional resistance to conditioning, providing optimal opportunity for breaking techniques, guaranteed to provide weeks of interactive entertainment before expiration. As Sarah spoke these words, Holbrook actually staggered backward, his form becoming less solid, less real. Emma's spirit blazed with light so bright that it illuminated every corner of the basement, revealing horrors that had been hidden in shadow. "Timothy Morrison," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying through the building like a bell tolling for the dead. 6 years old, curious nature, small frame, ideal for clients interested in cognitive degradation studies. Subject's high intelligence makes the deterioration process particularly satisfying to observe. Estimated useful lifespan, 2 to 3 weeks. Timothy's spirit joined Emma's light, and together they began to push back against the supernatural darkness that Holbrook had wrapped around this place for over a century. Sarah read each entry in its entirety, speaking aloud every horrific detail that Holbrook had recorded about these innocent children. She spoke of Mary's flexibility potential and Peter's high pain tolerance and Alice's aquatic adaptation capabilities. Each word was like a sword thrust into Holbrook's dark heart, each revelation a step toward justice long delayed. As she read, the basement began to change around them. The medical equipment rusted and crumbled, the photographs yellowed and fell from the walls, and the chains that had bound so many children turned to dust. Holbrook's special room was being cleansed by the power of truth finally spoken, but Holbrook himself was not finished. As his physical form began to dissolve, his voice grew louder, more desperate. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shrieked, his cultured accent completely gone now, replaced by something animalistic and raw. "Those children were nothing. Abandoned, unwanted, worthless. I gave them purpose, gave them value. My clients provided them with experiences they never could have imagined." "Your clients tortured and murdered them," Sarah replied, her voice steady as granite. "And you facilitated every moment of their suffering for money. They were going to die anyway," Holbrook screamed, his form flickering between human and something far more monstrous. "Disease, starvation, exposure, what difference does it make how they died? At least my way, their death served a purpose." Emma stepped forward, no longer the terrified child who had stood at the orphanage gates, but a spirit blazing with righteous fury. "Our lives had purpose," she said, her voice carrying the weight of all 5 murdered children. "We were loved, we had dreams, we mattered. You stole that from us, but you can't steal it anymore." The other children joined Emma, forming a circle around Holbrook's diminishing form. Their combined light was so bright that Sarah had to shield her eyes, but she could still hear their voices joining together in words that seemed to come from the very foundations of justice itself. "Ezra Holbrook," they said in unison, their young voices carrying power that shook the building to its core. "You are judged. You are found guilty. You are banished from this place forever." Holbrook's scream of rage and defeat echoed through the basement, through the building and out into the night beyond. His form collapsed in on itself like a dying star, growing smaller and darker until finally, with a sound like thunder rolling away into the distance, he vanished completely. The silence that followed was profound, peaceful in a way that Sarah had never experienced. The basement around them began to fade, the walls becoming transparent as if they were dissolving back into the realm of memory where they belonged. "It's over," Emma said, and for the first time since Sarah had met her, the little girl smiled with genuine joy. "He's gone. We're free." But even as the children celebrated their liberation, Sarah realized that her work was far from finished. The truth had been spoken, the evil banished, but justice demanded more than supernatural resolution. The world needed to know what had happened here. The victims needed to be remembered, honored, and mourned, and other children, in other places and other times, needed to be protected from monsters like Ezra Holbrook. As the basement faded away around them, and they found themselves standing once again in the ruins of the orphanage kitchen, Sarah made a silent promise to the 5 spirits who had trusted her with their truth. Their story would not be forgotten again. Standing in the ruins of the orphanage kitchen, Sarah watched as the 5 children's spirits began to change. The marks of their violent deaths were fading, Timothy's crushed skull healing, Mary's broken spine straightening, Peter's burns disappearing, Alice's waterlogged form drying, and Emma's throat wound, closing forever. For the first time in 136 years, they looked like the innocent children they had been before Holbrook's evil touched their lives. "We can feel it," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder. "The pull toward whatever comes next. We're not trapped here anymore." The building around them continued to fade, as if it were made of morning mist. The walls became transparent, the ceiling opened to reveal stars that seemed impossibly bright, and the very air grew lighter, cleaner, free of the oppressive weight that had hung over this place for more than a century. "But before we go," Timothy said, his young face now peaceful and whole, "there's something we need to show you, something Holbrook never knew we discovered." Alice took Sarah's hand, and despite being a spirit, her touch felt warm and real. "There are others, Sarah, not here but in other places, other children who fell victim to men like Holbrook." The world around them shifted, and suddenly Sarah found herself standing in what appeared to be a vast library with books stretching endlessly in all directions. But these weren't ordinary books. Each volume pulsed with its own inner light, and she somehow understood that each one contained the story of a child who had suffered and died at the hands of those who should have protected them. "This is the repository of lost voices," Mary explained, her spine now straight and strong. "Every child who dies unjustly, whose story goes untold, whose killer goes unpunished, their truth is preserved here, waiting for someone brave enough to listen and act." Peter pointed to a section where hundreds of books glowed with urgent red light. "Those are the active cases, Sarah. Children whose killers still walk free, whose deaths are still being covered up, whose spirits are still trapped by injustice." Emma moved to stand directly in front of Sarah, her dark eyes now clear and bright instead of haunted and hollow. "You have a gift, Sarah. You see the truth even when others want to hide it, and you're brave enough to fight for justice even when it costs you everything. That's why we were able to reach you, why we could trust you with our story." "These other children," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared at the countless volumes surrounding them, "they need help too." "Some do," Alice confirmed, "but not all of them need what we needed. Some just need their stories told, their killers exposed, their deaths acknowledged and mourned. Others need active intervention to stop ongoing crimes or prevent future victims." Timothy stepped forward, his young face serious with purpose. "We can't tell you which ones to choose, Sarah. That has to be your decision, but we can tell you that this work, this calling, it changes you. Once you start speaking for the dead, you can never really stop." Sarah looked around at the infinite library of lost voices, feeling the weight of so much untold suffering. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose, stronger than anything she had ever experienced in her academic career. "How will I know which stories to pursue?" "The same way you knew to help us," Emma said with a smile that seemed to light up the entire repository. "The children who need you most will find ways to reach you. A photograph that shouldn't exist, a document hidden where it shouldn't be, a voice in the wind calling your name. The dead have their own ways of communicating with those who are willing to listen." Mary approached and handed Sarah something that materialized in her small hands, a leather-bound journal that felt solid and real, despite existing in this ethereal space. "This will help you keep track," Mary said. "Every case you take on, every child you help, every truth you uncover, write it all down. Their stories matter, and they deserve to be preserved with the same care you would give to any historical document." The repository around them began to fade, and Sarah found herself back in the ruins of the orphanage as the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon. The building was just a building now, old, abandoned, but no longer haunted. The supernatural cold was gone, replaced by the normal chill of an October morning. "Our time is ending," Peter said, his form beginning to become translucent as the sun climbed higher. "But yours is just beginning." One by one, the children approached Sarah to say their final goodbyes. Timothy hugged her waist with small arms that felt surprisingly solid, whispering, "Thank you for giving us back our names." Mary took her hand and squeezed gently. "Thank you for making sure we mattered." Peter simply nodded with quiet dignity beyond his years. "Thank you for not giving up when it got scary." Alice kissed Sarah's cheek with lips that felt like butterfly wings. "Thank you for believing us." Finally, Emma stood before her, no longer the hollow-eyed ghost who had first appeared in an old photograph, but a radiant child spirit, ready to move on to whatever waited beyond. "Thank you for everything, Sarah," Emma said, her voice growing fainter as the dawn light grew stronger. "For seeing us, for hearing us, for fighting for us. We'll never forget you." "I'll never forget you either," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "Any of you." Emma smiled one last time, then looked up at the lightening sky with expression of pure joy. "I can see her," she whispered. "I can see my mama. She's waiting for me." The 5 children joined hands and began to walk toward the rising sun, their forms becoming more and more transparent with each step. As they faded from sight, Sarah heard their voices one last time, carried on the morning breeze like a blessing. "Remember us, remember our stories, and help the others who are still waiting." Then they were gone, leaving only the sound of birds singing in the trees and the normal sounds of a small town waking up to another day. But the journal Mary had given her remained solid and real in Sarah's hands, and she could feel its weight like a promise of work yet to be done. Sarah walked back to her car as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the orphanage grounds that no longer held any terror. She had entered this place as a historian researching a single mystery, but she was leaving as something else entirely, a voice for the voiceless, a seeker of justice for those who had been denied it in life. The town of Millbrook was still sleeping as she drove through its quiet streets, but Sarah knew that wouldn't last long. Soon, The story of Emma Whitmore and the 4 other murdered children would be front-page news across the country. Holbrook's crimes would be exposed, the truth would finally be told, and 5 children who had been forgotten by history would be remembered and mourned as they deserved. But more than that, Sarah understood that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, other children were waiting for someone to hear their stories, to fight for their justice, to ensure that their deaths were not meaningless. She had found her true calling at last, and she would not fail them. As she reached her cottage, Sarah opened the journal Mary had given her and wrote her first entry. Emma Whitmore, Timothy Morrison, Mary Sullivan, Peter Kowalski, and Alice Thompson. 5 children murdered by Ezra Holbrook between 1888 and 1892. Justice served October 31, 2024. May they rest in peace. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote 4 simple words that would guide her in all the work to come. Who needs help next? 3 days after the children's liberation, Sarah sat in the conference room at the Millbrook Police Department, surrounded by detectives, FBI agents, and representatives from the State Attorney General's office. Spread across the large table were photocopies of every document from Holbrook's hidden collection, each piece of evidence carefully catalogued and authenticated. Detective Maria Santos, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had been assigned as the lead investigator, studied the materials with a mixture of professional fascination and human revulsion. "Dr. Chen," she said, looking up from Holbrook's client correspondence. "In 30 years of police work, I've seen some terrible things, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. You're talking about a systematic child trafficking and murder operation that lasted for years." Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit nodded grimly. "What's particularly disturbing is the level of organization and documentation. Holbrook wasn't just a predator, he was running a business, complete with catalogs, pricing structures, and detailed client profiles." Sarah watched as the law enforcement officials processed the reality of what had happened in their quiet town more than a century ago. She had spent the past 3 days working with authorities to verify the authenticity of the documents and provide historical context for the crimes. "The 5 children whose remains we found on the orphanage grounds," Detective Santos continued, "have been positively identified through dental records and personal effects mentioned in these papers. We're treating this as 5 counts of first-degree murder, even though the perpetrator is long dead." Assistant District Attorney James Morrison, no relation to Timothy Morrison, as DNA testing had confirmed, leaned forward in his chair. "Dr. Chen, can you walk us through how you discovered these documents? The defense attorneys for any living accomplices are going to challenge every aspect of this evidence." Sarah recounted her discovery of the hidden compartment in Holbrook's basement, carefully omitting any mention of supernatural guidance. She had learned to present her findings in terms that would hold up in court and satisfy skeptical investigators. "The historical significance of this case goes far beyond Millbrook," Agent Torres said. "We've already identified 3 of Holbrook's clients from the correspondence, and while they're long dead, their families are still prominent in several states. We're looking at the possibility of generational criminal networks that may still be operating today." Detective Santos pulled out a thick file folder. "We've also been investigating similar disappearances at other orphanages and children's homes from the same time period. Based on the client list you found, Dr. Chen, it appears that Holbrook's operation may have been part of a much larger network spanning multiple states." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the conference room's air conditioning. How many other children might have been victims? "Potentially hundreds," Agent Torres replied soberly. "We're coordinating with law enforcement agencies in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire to review all unexplained child disappearances from 1880 to 1900. Your discovery has opened a window into a criminal enterprise we never knew existed." The door to the conference room opened, and Margaret Thornton entered, looking far older than her years. She had been instrumental in providing historical context and verifying the authenticity of various documents, but the revelation of the truth about the orphanage had taken a visible toll on her. "Margaret," Sarah said, rising to greet the elderly librarian, "how are you holding up?" "It's difficult," Margaret admitted, settling into a chair with careful movements. "My family has lived in this town for 4 generations, and to think that such evil existed here, that people knew and did nothing, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about your home." Detective Santos turned to Margaret with gentle professionalism. "Mrs. Thornton, we understand this is hard, but your cooperation has been invaluable." The Historical Society's records have helped us establish timelines and verify details that will be crucial if we find any living accomplices or ongoing criminal activity. Margaret nodded, then looked directly at Sarah. I've been thinking about what you said, about this being just the beginning. Are you really planning to continue this kind of work? Sarah touched the leather journal that had become her constant companion since that night at the orphanage. In the past 3 days, she had already received 2 messages through various means, a photograph slipped under her cottage door and a news article that appeared mysteriously in her email inbox, both seeming to point toward other cases that needed investigation. I think I have to, Sarah replied. These children trusted me with their truth, and there are others out there who need the same kind of help. The repository of lost voices isn't just a metaphor, it's a responsibility. Agent Torres looked up from the documents with interest. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to consult with the FBI on other historical cases involving missing children? Your expertise in both historical research and criminal investigation could be invaluable. Absolutely, Sarah said without hesitation. Whatever I can do to help. The meeting concluded with plans for a comprehensive investigation that would likely take years to complete. Sarah had agreed to serve as a historical consultant while continuing her own independent research into other cases. The authorities were also planning a proper burial for the 5 children, with a memorial service that would finally acknowledge their lives and honor their memory. As Sarah walked out of the police station into the crisp October afternoon, she found herself thinking about the media attention that was already beginning to build around the case. News vans had been arriving in Millbrook all morning, and reporters were already calling the discovery one of the most significant historical crime revelations of the century. That evening, Sarah stood in her cottage kitchen, updating her journal with the day's developments. The official investigation was important, but she knew that the real work, the work the children had called her to do, went far beyond legal proceedings and media coverage. She opened her laptop and began researching the first of the 2 new cases that had found their way to her. A 1923 photograph from a girls' school in Vermont showed a young student who had allegedly died in a dormitory fire. But something about the girl's expression in the picture suggested a different story. The second case involved a series of children who had disappeared from a summer camp in Maine during the 1950s, their bodies never found despite extensive searches. As Sarah worked late into the night, she felt the presence of purpose that had become her new constant companion. Emma and the others were at peace now, but their legacy lived on in the work they had inspired. Every case she took on, every truth she uncovered, every voice she gave to the silenced dead, it was all part of the promise she had made in that basement beneath the orphanage. The world was full of injustice, full of children whose stories had been buried by those with power and privilege. But Sarah had learned something important in Millbrook. The dead do not forget, and they do not give up. They wait, sometimes for decades or centuries, for someone with the courage to listen and the determination to act. She would not let them wait in vain. As midnight approached, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. This time, instead of a cryptic address or date, she found a simple question that made her heart race with anticipation. Are you ready for the next one? Sarah looked at the journal Mary had given her, at the growing list of cases that needed investigation, and at the pile of evidence that would soon bring justice for 5 children who had waited 136 years to have their stories told. She typed back a single word, yes. The work was just beginning, but Sarah Chen had found her true calling at last. She was no longer just a historian studying the past. She was a warrior fighting for justice, a voice for the voiceless, and a guardian of the truth that some would prefer to keep buried forever, and she would not stop until every lost child found their way home. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the orphanage, the entire town of Millbrook gathered in Riverside Cemetery for a memorial service that was 136 years overdue. The 5 small caskets containing the remains of Emma Whitmore, Timothy Morrison, Mary Sullivan, Peter Kowalski, and Alice Thompson were arranged beneath a magnificent oak tree that had been planted specifically for this ceremony. Sarah stood near the front of the crowd, wearing the silver cross Margaret had given her, and holding the leather journal that had become her most precious possession. Around her, hundreds of people from Millbrook and beyond had come to pay their respects to children whose names had finally been spoken aloud after more than a century of silence. The memorial service was conducted by Pastor Elizabeth Warren from the town's Methodist Church, a woman whose compassionate demeanor and genuine grief for these long-dead children had moved everyone who met her. She had worked closely with Sarah to ensure that the service would honor not just the victims, but also acknowledge the injustice they had suffered. "We gather today not just to mourn 5 innocent lives lost," Pastor Warren said, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery, "but to bear witness to their stories, to acknowledge the truth that was hidden for so long, and to promise that their deaths will not be forgotten again." Margaret Thornton stepped forward to read a statement on behalf of the Millbrook Historical Society. Despite her age and the emotional weight of recent revelations, her voice was strong and clear. "For decades, our community unknowingly carried the burden of these unsolved crimes. We lived in the shadow of evil, without understanding why certain places felt haunted, why certain stories felt incomplete. Today, we acknowledge that shadow and commit ourselves to ensuring that such evil never finds sanctuary in our town again." Detective Santos spoke about the ongoing investigation and the importance of historical justice, while Agent Torres discussed the broader implications of the case for law enforcement agencies across New England. But it was Sarah's words that seemed to resonate most deeply with the assembled crowd. "Emma, Timothy, Mary, Peter, and Alice were not just victims," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the emotion she felt. "They were children with hopes and dreams, with personalities and preferences, with the same capacity for joy and love as any child today. They deserved protection, they deserved justice, and they deserved to be remembered." She looked down at the 5 small headstones that bore not just names and dates, but brief descriptions of each child's personality based on the orphanage records Sarah had uncovered. Emma was remembered as curious and brave, Timothy as kind and questioning, Mary as gentle and artistic, Peter as determined and loyal, and Alice as joyful and loving. "But their legacy extends far beyond their own stories," Sarah continued. "Their courage in reaching across time to seek justice has opened our eyes to other children who still need our help, other stories that still need to be told. In their memory, we commit ourselves to being the protectors they never had, the voices they were denied in life." As the formal service concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah noticed a group of individuals who had remained behind. They were a diverse collection of people, historians, journalists, law enforcement officers, and others, but they all shared the same intense, purposeful expression that Sarah had come to recognize in herself. A woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes approached Sarah first. "Dr. Chen, I'm Dr. Amanda Foster from the University of Vermont. I've been following your work, and I believe I have a case that might interest you." Dr. Foster explained that she had been researching a series of mysterious deaths at a boarding school in the 1940s, when she had come across evidence suggesting that some of the deaths might not have been accidents. "The parallels to your Millbrook case are striking," she said. "Children from families with no power or influence, deaths that were too easily explained away, and records that seem to have been deliberately altered." Behind Dr. Foster stood a man in his 30s who introduced himself as Detective Kyle Morrison from the Boston Police Department's Cold Case Unit. "We've been working on some unsolved disappearances from the 1970s and 80s, he said. "Children from the foster care system who vanished without a trace. After seeing your work here, I think there might be connections we missed." A third person stepped forward, a young woman with a press badge who looked barely old enough to be out of college. "I'm Jenny Martinez from the Boston Globe," she said. "I'd like to write a series about historical crimes against children, focusing on cases where justice was delayed but not denied. Would you be willing to work with me on this?" Sarah looked at this impromptu gathering of people who had been drawn to Millbrook by the story of 5 murdered children, and she realized that Emma's final words about helping others were already coming true. The children's courage in seeking justice had created ripples that were spreading far beyond their original case. "I think Emma and the others would be pleased," Sarah said, glancing back toward the fresh graves beneath the oak tree. "They wanted their story to help other children, and it looks like that's exactly what's happening." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself at the center of an informal coalition of people dedicated to investigating historical crimes against children. Phone numbers were exchanged, research strategies discussed, and tentative partnerships formed. Dr. Foster agreed to share her Vermont boarding school files. Detective Morrison offered to provide access to the Boston PD's cold case database, and Jenny Martinez proposed creating a public awareness campaign that might encourage other victims or witnesses to come forward. As the group began to disperse, Sarah noticed that the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery. For a moment, she thought she saw 5 small figures standing beneath the oak tree, but when she looked again, There was only the gentle movement of leaves in the evening breeze. Margaret approached, as Sarah was preparing to leave. "You know," the elderly librarian said, "I've been thinking about what you said during the service, about being the protectors these children never had." "Yes, the Historical Society has been discussing this, and we'd like to establish a foundation in memory of Emma and the others. We want to fund research into historical crimes against children, provide resources for families of missing children, and ensure that stories like this never get buried again." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I think that's exactly what they would have wanted." As Sarah drove home through the darkening streets of Millbrook, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day when she had discovered Emma's photograph in the basement of the Historical Society. She had come to town as a historian researching orphanages, but she was leaving as something entirely different: an advocate for justice, a voice for the voiceless, and a guardian of truths that others would prefer to keep hidden. Her cottage felt different now too. Where once it had been simply a temporary residence, it now felt like a headquarters for her new mission. The kitchen table where she had first examined Emma's photograph was now covered with files from potential new cases, and the walls were decorated with maps marking locations where other lost children might be waiting for someone to tell their stories. Sarah opened her journal and turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "Emma Whitmore Memorial Foundation Case Log," and below that she began listing the potential investigations that had been brought to her attention just that day. As she worked, Sarah felt a presence in the room, not frightening as it once would have been, but comforting. It was as if Emma and the others were still with her in spirit, guiding her toward the children who needed help next. The work would be difficult, sometimes dangerous, and often heartbreaking, but it was also necessary, and Sarah knew that she had found her true calling at last. Every child deserved to be protected, to be valued, to be remembered, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure that promise was kept. Outside her cottage window, the town of Millbrook settled into another peaceful evening, no longer haunted by the secrets it had unknowingly carried for over a century. The evil that had once flourished in its shadows had been exposed and banished, and 5 children who had waited so long for justice had finally found peace. But in other towns, in other times, other children were still waiting, and Sarah Chen would not rest until every one of them had been found. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the lobby of the newly opened Emma Whitmore Memorial Center for Missing Children in downtown Millbrook. The building, a restored Victorian mansion that had once belonged to one of the town's founding families, now served as headquarters for the foundation that had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. The walls were lined with photographs and case files representing dozens of historical missing children cases that had been solved or reopened thanks to the network of investigators, historians, and law enforcement officers who had united under the banner of the Emma Whitmore Foundation. Each solved case represented not just closure for families, but justice for children, whose voices had been silenced by those who believed their crimes would never be discovered. Margaret Thornton, now serving as the Foundation's historical research director despite her advanced age, approached Sarah with a satisfied smile and a steaming cup of coffee. "The Vermont boarding school case is officially closed," Margaret announced. "Dr. Foster's research, combined with the new evidence uncovered by the state police, has resulted in criminal charges against 3 living accomplices. 12 children who died between 1943 and 1947 will finally receive proper burials and recognition as murder victims rather than accident statistics." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully and walked over to the memorial wall where photographs of solved cases were displayed. Each image showed a child who had been failed by the adults who should have protected them, but whose stories had finally been told thanks to the work inspired by Emma and her 4 companions. "Any word from Detective Morrison about the Boston foster care cases?" Sarah asked. "Better than that," Margaret replied with excitement. "He arrested the last member of the trafficking ring yesterday. 7 children who disappeared between 1978 and 1985 have been accounted for, and the survivors who were sold into illegal adoptions are finally being reunited with their birth families." The success of the foundation still amazed Sarah. What had begun as a desperate attempt to help 5 murdered children find peace had evolved into a nationwide network of professionals dedicated to solving historical crimes against children. Universities were offering new courses in historical criminology. Law enforcement agencies were reopening cold cases with fresh perspectives, and most importantly, families who had lost children decades ago were finally getting answers. Jenny Martinez, the young journalist who had become the Foundation's media director, entered the lobby with her usual energy and enthusiasm. At 26, she had already won 2 journalism awards for her investigative series about historical crimes against children. "Sarah, you need to see this," Jenny said, holding up her laptop. "The documentary about Emma's case just won the Emmy for Outstanding Historical Documentary, but more importantly, we've received 47 new tips about potential cases just since it aired last week." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and soberness that came with each new success. Every case they solved meant justice for forgotten victims, but it also revealed the staggering scope of crimes that had been committed against vulnerable children throughout history. "Have you had a chance to review the files from the Oregon orphan train investigation?" Sarah asked. "Dr. Foster is flying out there next week to examine the evidence personally," Jenny replied. "If her preliminary assessment is correct, we could be looking at organized child trafficking that spanned multiple states and lasted for decades." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself drawn to the quiet contemplation room on the building's second floor. The room was designed as a place where families of victims could find peace and where investigators could reflect on the weight of their work. At its center stood a beautiful stained glass window depicting 5 children holding hands beneath a tree, their faces turned toward a bright light that seemed to emanate from beyond the glass itself. Sarah often came here when she needed to remember why this work mattered, why the long hours and emotional toll were worth bearing. Today, as she sat in the comfortable chair facing the memorial window, she opened her journal to review the past year's accomplishments. The Emma Whitmore Foundation had directly contributed to solving 43 historical missing children cases across 17 states. They had helped identify the remains of 32 children who had been buried as unknowns, reunited 8 survivors of trafficking with their families, and provided closure to more than 200 families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. But beyond the statistics, Sarah knew that the Foundation's most important achievement was changing how society viewed crimes against children. No longer were mysterious disappearances dismissed as runaway cases. No longer were the deaths of poor or marginalized children automatically attributed to accident or natural causes. The Emma Whitmore Foundation had created a culture of accountability that demanded justice for every child, regardless of their background or circumstances. As Sarah wrote in her journal, she became aware of a familiar presence in the room. The temperature didn't drop as it once had, and there was no sense of supernatural urgency. Instead, there was a feeling of warmth, of approval, of peace that seemed to emanate from the stained glass window itself. "We're proud of you," a voice whispered, so softly that Sarah wasn't entirely sure she had heard it or simply felt it in her heart. Sarah looked up at the window and smiled. "We're just getting started," she said aloud, knowing that somehow, somewhere, Emma and the others could hear her. Over the past year, Sarah had learned to recognize the signs when a new case was calling to her. Sometimes it was a photograph that appeared mysteriously in her mail, sometimes a news article that contained details that didn't quite fit the official narrative, and sometimes simply a feeling that drew her to a particular location or time period. Today's sign came in the form of a handwritten letter that Jenny brought to her as the day was ending. The envelope bore no return address and had been slipped under the Foundation's front door sometime during the afternoon. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a child's drawing, a crayon sketch of what appeared to be a summer camp with several small figures standing around a lake. At the bottom, written in the careful handwriting of someone very young, were the words, "We're still here, please find us." Sarah studied the drawing carefully, noting details that suggested it had been created sometime in the 1960s based on the clothing styles and architectural elements depicted. But the paper itself was fresh, new, as if it had been drawn yesterday. "Another case?" Margaret asked, looking over Sarah's shoulder at the mysterious drawing. "It looks that way," Sarah replied, already feeling the familiar pull of purpose that came with each new investigation. "I think these children have been waiting even longer than Emma and the others." As Sarah prepared to leave the memorial center for the day, she paused one last time in front of the stained glass window. The 5 children depicted there seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon sunlight, their hands still joined in eternal friendship, their faces still turned toward the light of whatever peaceful realm they now inhabited. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, not just to Emma and her companions, but to all the children whose courage in death had inspired this work, whose refusal to be forgotten had made justice possible for so many others. The work would continue tomorrow and the day after that, and for as long as there were children whose stories needed to be told. The Emma Whitmore Memorial Foundation had become more than just an organization. It was a promise to every child who had ever suffered in silence that their lives mattered, their deaths would be mourned, and their killers would face justice, no matter how much time had passed. As Sarah walked out into the crisp autumn evening, she carried with her the weight of new cases to investigate and old wounds to heal. But she also carried the knowledge that she was not alone in this work. Emma and the others had shown her that the bonds between the living and the dead could be bridges toward justice, and that love and determination were more powerful than any evil that sought to hide in the shadows. The lost voices would be silent no more. In her coat pocket, the mysterious drawing seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if the children who had created it knew that help was finally on the way. Sarah smiled as she thought about the investigation ahead, knowing that somewhere, somehow, 5 spirits who had found their peace were watching over every step of the journey. The work of justice never ended, but neither did the hope that carried it forward. And in Millbrook, Massachusetts, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the town that had once harbored such terrible secrets now stood as a beacon of truth, proving that no crime was too old to solve, no victim too forgotten to remember, and no evil too powerful to overcome when good people chose to act with courage and compassion. The girl in the apron at the orphanage gate had finally come home, and she had brought justice with her,